In today's video, we're going to be looking at 5 ways to improve your reading life, or 5 ways to become a better reader. I recently read this book, The Reading Life by C.S. Lewis, and when I picked up this book, I didn't actually realise that it was just a collection of quotes or letters and essays and snippets from various books that C.S. Lewis has written. And if I'd known that that's what this book was, I definitely wouldn't have bought it, because I really hate reading things outside of context or without the full picture to understand it by. However, I am really glad that I did pick up this book and read it anyway, because despite the fact that it was snippets and little sections of things rather than the whole, I learned so much from those small snippets. C.S. Lewis has so much wisdom and insight into reading wisely and carefully and making reading fun that I just really wanted to share some of the things that I learned from this book that maybe will help you, either if you're someone who doesn't enjoy reading, finds books a little bit boring and hard to get into. I think there's tips in this book for you. Or if, like me, you love reading, you read so many books, you're always with a book in your hands, but perhaps you want to think of ways of changing up what you read, or engaging with books in a new way. Perhaps you forget what you read quite often. I definitely do that. Then there are also some really helpful tips in this book for you. Just to preface this video by saying these are C.S. Lewis's reading tips and insights. They're not from me. I've taken them from this book and sort of adapted them with some examples from my own life. I also don't feel like you need to do any of these things to be a reader. These are just ideas of things that maybe can change your reading style or help you to engage with reading in a new way. I don't think you need to do more to be a good reader, but I just wanted to share these ideas because I found them really interesting and I hope that you might do too. So here are 5 ways, that's one. Here are 5 ways to become a better reader according to C.S. Lewis. We're going to start with a fairly simple and obvious one, but still one that I feel very challenged by, and that is reread books. In a letter from C.S. Lewis to Arthur Greeves in 1933, C.S. Lewis wrote, "Clearly, one must read every good book at least once every 10 years. When I was little and had less books and less money, but a lot more time, I always reread books. Since I've gotten older, I think I've slipped into a little bit of book FOMO. I feel like there are so many good books and so many new books coming out that I want to read that I simply don't have time to reread the ones that I've already read. I want to read the new ones so that I don't miss out on a potential new favourite story." However, when people ask me for my favourite book or my favourite books, I do find that I gravitate towards the ones that I've reread rather than perhaps the ones that are logically the best books. There is something about a book read multiple times that feels more a part of me than a book that is logically really brilliant. I really like the idea of rereading the good books, as C.S. Lewis says, every 10 years. I think that they really prove the test of time if they can still be enjoyable to us 10 years on. And if those books that we read 10 years ago are no longer enjoyable to us, C.S. Lewis would actually argue that they probably weren't that good of a book in the first place, which leads me on to the second tip for becoming a better reader, which is read children's books. In his essay on 3 ways of writing for children, C.S. Lewis wrote, "I am almost inclined to set it up as a canon that a children's story which is enjoyed only by children is a bad children's story." He further goes on to elaborate that he now enjoys Tolstoy and Jane Austen as well as the fairy tales that he enjoyed as a child. And he says that if he'd had to give up the fairy tales in order to enjoy the novelists, in order to enjoy Tolstoy and Jane Austen, then he wouldn't necessarily have grown in his reading, he'd have just changed. Growth is being able to love and appreciate and enjoy those things with a newfound perspective. For instance, I've recently been reading the Anne of Green Gables series, which is a children's book series, and I have been loving it. I've been enjoying it so much, and I think I have been enjoying it in a very different way now to how I would have enjoyed it as a child. There are things that I pick up on now that I'm older that I wouldn't have picked up on necessarily as a child, and things that I enjoy more now. For instance, all of the descriptions of nature and the seasons, particularly the changing of seasons, that's something that I think I appreciate a lot more now. And so I can still enjoy that story now as an adult with a newfound perspective and new loves and new interests. That isn't to say that we shouldn't probably leave some things behind in our childhood and in our past, but there is so much to gain from a children's classic, so definitely don't dismiss them. Some of my favourite children's stories that I still enjoy now, aside from Anne of Green Gables, are The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis, of course, The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, and also Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. I would recommend any of those books if you are looking to embrace some classic children's fiction. The third tip I want to share is surrender yourself. In his book, An Experiment on Criticism, C.S. Lewis wrote, "The first demand any work of any art makes upon us is surrender. Look, listen, receive, get yourself out of the way. There is no good asking first whether the work before you deserves such a surrender, for until you've surrendered, you cannot possibly find out." Books have the power to not just let us see what others are experiencing, but to feel it too. To exist beyond yourself for a moment and to reject the facts as they are for you, as they are for me, in favour of the facts as they are. We get to observe from different eyes and different perspectives and different lives. C.S. Lewis likened reading to becoming 1,000 men and yet remaining myself. He wrote, "Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself. I am never more myself than when I do." When we read, we become something beyond just ourselves. As people, we are built to love and to worship and to learn, and all of these things require us to get out of ourselves, even just for a moment. And that is, for me, the most powerful and important thing about reading, both fiction and non-fiction. And I wonder how many books I personally have looked over because I didn't surrender myself to them, and I did just presume that it wouldn't be a book that I would enjoy, so why put my whole self into it? And a way perhaps to help you to do that is tip 4, which is map your books. In another letter to Arthur Greeves in 1932, C.S. Lewis wrote, "To enjoy a book like that thoroughly, I find I have to treat it as a sort of hobby and set about it seriously. I begin by making a map at one of the end leaves. Then I put a genealogical tree or two. Then I put a running headline at the top of each page. Finally, I index at the end all the passages I have for any reason underlined. I often wonder, considering how people enjoy themselves developing photos or making scrapbooks, why so few people make a hobby of their reading in this way. Many an otherwise dull book which I have had to read have I enjoyed in this way. With a fine-nibbed pen in my hand, one is making something all the time, and a book so read acquires the charm of a toy without listing that of a book." I don't know who needs to hear this, but it's okay to write in your book. It's okay to underline and highlight and write notes and scribble things down. I think what often stops me from doing that in my books is the fear that I'm not going to like the book and I'm going to want to sell it, and then I'm not going to be able to sell it because I've marked the book. But then I think of the piece of advice we've just talked about of surrendering ourselves to books and not knowing if we're going to love it until we fully surrender ourselves to it. Honestly, the only book that I've really done this to is the Bible, and I can honestly say that it makes me engage with what I read so much better. And when I reread sections of the Bible, I love being able to explore what I've thought about it before and to see whether my reflections are the same or if they've changed or what might have been revealed to me at one point when I've read it may be completely different. So mapping my books is definitely something that I would love to try. I love the idea of making a hobby out of reading a book, a hobby out of mapping and exploring and picking apart a story. Maybe if this really scares you or you're really apprehensive about marking in a new book, you could buy a secondhand copy of a book, or you could just map a book that you've read before. So you've already kind of got an idea of the sorts of things that appear in the book, and so you can mark it that way with a little bit more confidence about what you're writing about. And the fifth and final tip is read old books. C.S. Lewis wrote, "None of us can fully escape this blindness, but we shall certainly increase it and weaken our guard against it if we read only modern books. Where they are true, they will give us truths which we half knew already. Where they are false, they will aggravate the error with which we are already dangerously ill. The palliative is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds, and this can be done only by reading old books." Not, of course, that there is any magic about the past. People were no cleverer than they are now. They made as many mistakes as we, but not the same mistakes. To be sure, the books of the future would be just as good a corrective as the books of the past, but unfortunately, we cannot get at them. I think C.S. Lewis is suggesting that reading old books actually helps us to stay in tune with our current world rather than distant from it. I recently read in a completely different book about a term that C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, by which he meant the uncritical acceptance of the intellectual climate common to our own age, and the assumption that whatever has gone out of date is on that account discredited. He says that rather than just assuming that what we believe right now, or a worldview that we might have right now, is the most intelligent and wise and knowledgeable assumption, we should first find out why the previous worldview went out of date. Reading old books allows us to look at the world through perhaps an outdated lens or an outdated perspective and question why it's become out of date, and actually ask that question rather than just assuming that we know better now. And that helps us to really engage with our world in a much more grounded way. So those are 5 of the ways that C.S. Lewis suggests and discusses about reading that can help us to become better and more intelligent readers, based on some of the snippets that were in this book. I particularly agree with all that he said on children's books. I really do believe that a good children's book is good as an adult as well. And the tip that I really want to incorporate into my reading more is the idea of rereading the good books, rereading the favourite books every decade. I think that 10 years is such a good amount of time to read that book again, and if you still love something 10 years later, I think it really does stand the test of time. Let me know in the comments which of these tips you found most helpful, and also if you have any tips for becoming a better reader, or just tips for how people can enjoy reading in a new way. Please let me know in the comments down below. Also, just a reminder, these are all ideas. They are not definites that you have to do in order to become a better reader. Better reader is a very subjective term anyway. This video is just for some fun and just to share some interesting ideas that I've read about. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day. I'll see you very soon in the next video.